light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I'm Sister Who. In discussing how to address, how to understand, how to work toward an understanding of autism with a group the other day, a phrase that we came up that I think really applies to a lot more things is the notion of remembering the complexity while addressing the focus. Remembering the complexity while addressing the focus. And there are so many topics in my head at the moment that relates to, and I'll try to weave a number of them into the show in a reasonably coherent fashion. But it does seem, as a person with autism, like my thoughts are always racing way ahead of me, and there's too many thoughts all at once. And so I'm trying to pick which ones might be the most effective to you as the viewers of the show. Remembering the complexity while addressing the focus. Within these shows, I select topics. I select something to center the conversation around. And yet, the problem with that, or minor problem perhaps, is that we have to remember that this is not the way these things will be experienced. That as much as I can talk about a particular focus, there is basically no moment in life in which I am dealing with only that focus. Within every single moment of life, I am a fusion of body, mind, and spirit, as are each of you. Our emotions, our thoughts, the physical state of our bodies all comes to bear on how that moment is experienced, how we're able to respond to it, what we are able to make from it, or make within it. I guess what I'm really trying to address in this episode then is the relationship between a specific focus and a surrounding complexity. And quite a number of years ago, since I've been Sister Who now for over 26 years, one of the ways of understanding Sister Who that I discovered was that of the archetype of the sacred clown. This tribal role of a person that seems to be some equivalent of this in virtually every tribal society, but it's the person in the tribe who would teach using symbols and metaphors, questions, contrary actions, anything that would keep people growing, that would give them a new perspective or a new experience or a new way of thinking about things. And so within tribal societies, the role has so many different names. One of the more common names is the sacred clown. The sacred clown being distinguished from the circus clown in that a circus clown is trying to make people laugh. The sacred clown is trying to make people grow. Sometimes they laugh because they're nervous or because they're uncomfortable with the intensity of an insight. But the purpose is not to make them laugh, the purpose is to help them to grow. I've been working on a book manuscript for quite a number of years, and I always say maybe this is the year I'll get it finished finally, but essentially talking about the ways that I came to understand myself as Sister Who and understand the spiritual calling of being Sister Who. And in trying to describe, years ago, trying to describe my understanding of what a sacred clown really is. What is it that makes a sacred clown a sacred clown? What is it that theoretically, hypothetically, all sacred clowns have in common? And one of the hypotheses or assertions that I came up with was that sacred clowns understand just how interconnected everything is, and because everything is so interconnected, that there are metaphors that can be drawn from a particular area that amazingly sometimes have applicability to a lot of other areas outside of that. The conversation in which this idea first arose was a discussion of understanding autism. The application of that idea, though, goes far, far beyond that and is somewhat synonymous with what I've just said about the sacred clowns, that it's remembering the complexity while addressing the focus, that there is a specific lesson or focus or insight or something that the sacred clown is attempting to communicate right now. And in each and every moment of our lives, there is something that each of us is trying to communicate at each moment, and it will change from one moment to the next. What I'm trying to communicate in this moment will not be the same as what I'm trying to communicate to someone else tomorrow. Or even 5 minutes apart, walking through a crowded room with diverse people. With each person you meet, the topic keeps changing. And even in a single conversation, there have been people with whom I attempted to have a conversation, but it was very difficult because in some cases I found they were actually changing the subject about every 10 seconds, making a comment about something else and then bridging to another topic altogether, not realizing that to be understood, the two topics need to be discussed individually rather than at the same time. It would be like trying to describe an orchestra, which is composed of a large number of instruments, and trying to come up with a description that applies to all of them. And you would be stuck with a very vague generality that wasn't completely accurate to any one instrument, because it's the combined synthesis of the orchestra that makes the orchestra what it is. It's not, but to do that, you have to first focus upon the individual instruments that make up the orchestra. That the orchestra will have a diminished sound if there are an inadequate number of violins or no violins at all. The orchestra will have a very different sound which may or may not be as helpful to the particular piece of music if there are no flutes. But then the dynamics of a flute and the dynamics of a violin are very, very different. And so in a sense, we have to talk about, if we want to understand the role of the flute within the orchestra, we focus upon the flute while recognizing that in most cases the flute will never be heard all by itself within the orchestra. That in any orchestral performance, you will hear the flute a little stronger, a little more prominent, somehow over whatever other music is around it, but you will not hear it in isolation. Because of the contrast between the pitches, for example, you may choose to have a flute playing at the same time as you have a string bass playing. The low and the high notes allow each to accentuate and augment and, in a sense, to make more beautiful each other. By having a contrast, the high notes of the flute become distinct. By having the low notes, the voice of the flute doesn't appear thin and perhaps tinny, or like there's like it's incomplete. By having the full range from the highs, the very highs to the very lows, from the piccolo to the timpani and bass notes on any number of instruments, the two interweave and create a more beautiful acoustic fabric of sound than either one could produce all on its own. If one is going to write music for an orchestra, one would have to write music for the flute and another set of music for the string bass, and another set of music for the cello, and another set of music for the trombone. And yet, as each of these pieces of music is being written, one has to be aware of the greater complexity within which this solo voice, or this voice, not necessarily solo, with which this voice will be played. That the voice of the flute will be accentuated and made more beautiful by having the other voices as part of the symphonic conversation. That in listening to a symphony, it's as if you're listening to a number of instruments having a very carefully choreographed conversation. If we can bring that metaphor to our lives, that would, I hope, I would think, allow us to act with more civility toward each other. That it is not that anyone means to put down or silence or outshout or disrespect another voice, but rather that we are seeking ways that all of our words can be woven together into a greater presentation of human wisdom and relationship than any of us could manage on our own. There's some things musically and relationally that just cannot be illustrated without having a full orchestra to do it. There's certain communal jobs that simply cannot be done by an individual because it requires many hands working in synchronicity. Almost as if everything was perfectly choreographed, but of course we all know that life isn't that perfectly choreographed in most settings. We show up for a moment, we do what we can with it, but we really don't know what this or the next moment will include. Sometimes I use the expression, life is pitching curveballs again, using the metaphor of a baseball game, that there are things that show up in our lives unexpected and in ways that at the time may not make any sense. I find that especially true of struggles and painful moments. It would be so much easier to tolerate such things if one knew why they were there or what higher purpose was being accomplished. That in the same way that I sweep the floor of my house not because I like sweeping, but because I like living in a clean house. And I understand that in order to have a clean house, I have to engage in tasks that may not be any fun, but they contribute toward the creation of an environment within which I would enjoy living. On a slightly more vulgar note, perhaps, it would be equivalent to saying that even in Buckingham Palace or the most expensive hotel in New York City, somebody still has to clean the toilets. It's simply part of life that has to be done. There's nothing enjoyable about it. There doesn't need to be. But we need to accept that not everything in life is going to bring us bliss. Some things are simply necessary. While we're doing the necessary things, though, it becomes equally important for the creativity and beauty of our spirits to hold on to those dreams. Our dreams are aspirations, the things that give us a why, that tell us why it is we are doing the mundane required things like cleaning the toilet and sweeping the floor and washing the windows and doing the laundry. Why do we do all these things? Not to just exist for however many years until we die, but rather to actually pursue some kind of growth or aspiration, some larger dream of what we want our life, that some larger dream that gives meaning to our lives. That, well, for Sister Who, it's the dream, I guess, the notion of at some point through some means finding a way to construct and operate a genuinely interfaith spiritual center where people of any belief system or none can come and tend to the non-physical parts of themselves in whatever ways they find effective. If they would like me to help them create a ritual to process something emotionally or psychologically, I'm happy to do that. If they would prefer to have a contemplative discussion about how the divine has been perceived and how the divine has made itself known to diverse people in diverse places, that's a conversation I'm happy to have with them. I don't have any judgment about how things are supposed to be. In terms of saying, in terms of identities. I just made that statement, and now I'm questioning myself, because as a generality, virtually any statement, as a generality, begins to break down, because there are exceptions to every statement. I don't want to tell someone what to believe, because I think each individual has so many variables and so many unique qualities in his or her experience that I do not have sufficient wisdom to tell him or her how he or she is supposed to live, what they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to become, in the creative, moral, ethical sense, I guess. That doesn't stop me from saying we need to pursue love and wisdom. We need to avoid being cruel to each other. We need to avoid overlooking the treasure in each other. We need to be willing to have a dialogue, so that it's not me trying to persuade you that you have to be like me. How ridiculous would that be? You can't be like me. Nobody can be like me. We can only be like ourselves. The most dedicated person who wants to be an imitation of me will never succeed in truly being me. And I don't think that's the reason they were born. Each of us is born to be ourselves, and finding that most authentic, true, honest, beautiful, wise, and loving self, and recognizing that we are the raw material from which the creative work of our lives can be built. And so we choose a focus at different times, a focus of something to learn, a language to acquire, a skill to acquire, and yet remembering in all of that the larger complexity of our lives, that there are floors to be swept, and bathrooms to be cleaned, and pets to be fed, and phone calls to be made, and relationships to be maintained. But to find a way of doing all of those things that doesn't leave us without our own unique individual life purpose. So much of the current age seems to have gravitated toward the pragmatic sorts of, how do we get the bills paid? How do we get the house built? How do we take care of the kids? How do we take care of the pets? It would be easy to be so immersed in all of those details that one forgets the deeper why of our being. That the reason I exist, the reason I'm here as Sister Who, is specifically to nurture the personal and spiritual growth of others. Because I am not God, because I am not the divine, I bring my very best gifts and abilities and sensitivities and wisdom to it. But I am not the highest, I am not the embodiment of highest wisdom and greatest love. I believe each of us is what you might call a divine spark, a tiny little piece of that embodiment of highest wisdom and greatest love that I understand God to be. For someone else, however, they may or may not see a need to think of God as a person. And do I think of God as a person? That's a very good question. I guess I would say not a person in the sense that humanity typically defines personhood. God is much more than that. To take everything that humanity is and has and believes and suggest that that is all part of God, I guess looking at the size of the universe and the scope of things depicted within the Hubble telescope photos, everything that humanity is and believes and has experienced and felt may all be part of that higher wisdom, that highest wisdom and greatest love that God is. But I would speculate that it couldn't account for more than 2% of all that God is. By definition, God is beyond human comprehension. And what we mean by God is it's something we all need to contemplate, but a final definition is so elusive. The various times when I've had discussions with friends and acquaintances who describe themselves as being on a spiritual path of atheism, I've done my very best to respect that, because that's where they're at that point. And in respecting that, while also maintaining my own experience, I express to them that I perceive God to be the embodiment of highest wisdom and greatest love. But if that is not how God chooses to reveal God's self to them, then at the very least, I don't want to get in the way. I want them to be able to have whatever conversation with the divine they would like. There was a number of books written a number of years ago that were very successful for a time. I don't know that I hear as much about them anymore, and I respect that these books were enormously helpful to a lot of people. The one little, I don't know if it's a request or limitation, I guess, that I would, or the one little edit, I guess, I would offer if I could have been part of that process, which I wasn't, is that instead of titling the books Conversations with God, I would prefer that the author had titled the books My Conversations with God, because the conversations with God recorded in those books have all kinds of insights to offer, but they're not the final word. Conversations with that which is truly God are ongoing and may not even involve language. It may be the scientist or the atheist moving through life discovering all sorts of things from time to time that make them stop and pause in awe and simply no words to say. The only word that comes to mind is wow, but it is so inadequate for those experiences of deep awe where one looks at a photograph of the Hubble telescope and then somehow determines the scope and scale and size of the picture and how many light years across are the dimensions of this photo. And to place not only the Earth but our entire solar system within that photo, would it even be visible? Because what we're looking at is a picture of a space that is so huge that we couldn't travel across it if we were flying in our fastest spaceship for our whole lives. As vast as the universe is, and if all of that is the substance, if you will, of this entity we call God, I suppose it can be described scientifically, theologically, poetically, creatively, physically, scientifically, all sorts of different ways. And I don't know that any one of them is any more or less right than any other, because we're all ultimately talking about the same thing. It is just so beyond our ability to comprehend it all. And sometimes that's what we need most, is a moment to step back and regain a sense of our own humility and a sense that the universe doesn't revolve around us, and that life is not about some sort of narcissistic, self-indulgent, selfish accumulation of memories and pleasure. It's about seeing what good we can do and what we can learn while we're here, because at some point we're going to run out of time, just as we always run out of time on these shows. I hope nonetheless that what I've shared in the last half hour has served to inspire your own thoughts and your own wonderings, that you can go on through your lives in ways that appreciate, maybe even find inspiration in the ways that we are surrounded by infinite diversity and infinite combination. That there is always someone new to meet, a specific individual, not the embodiment of a category, a specific experience that will be unique in comparison to everyone else's experiences. And perhaps even a specific insight that may be unique in comparison to others' insights, which is why it is so wonderful to have dialogue, so that I can learn your insights and you can learn mine, and by sharing all of our insights together, humanity becomes more than it has ever been. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Thank you for watching.